a triangle, right? To add two sides. Okay. The thing about it is that Pythagoras' theorem appeared on the Rhine papyrus in 1600 BC. In other words, 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born, Pythagoras' theorem was found on the Rhine papyrus and also on the Moscow papyrus. The Moscow papyrus dates back to 1800 BC, 1800 BC. So we're talking about the Moscow papyrus predated Pythagoras by 1,200, 1,200 years. So let's define plagiarism. Plagiarism is taking someone else's works or ideas and putting your name on them or taking credit for it on your own. And when we're talking about Western civilization is kind of riddled with plagiarism. Okay, you think about that in terms of Thales. Thales was also spent time in Egypt. It's really interesting because when I first started, when I was in college and they're talking about Aristotle and Plato and Socrates and all those guys, I kind of imagine them sitting on the side of a hill, smoking a blunt, coming up with all these profound ideas. However, when I got to graduate school, I learned that most of those famous Greek authors spent time in Egypt. As George James in his book Stolen Legacy mentioned that most of all those Greeks, Herodotus, Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Thales, Archimedes, they all were educated in Egypt. So according to James and other scholars, what Aristotle did was just took his name and put him on these Egyptian mystery schools and called them his own. But actually, when you stop and think about it, though, plagiarism permeates or pervades Western scholarships or Western European, Western civilization scholars. There's a lot of many examples of plagiarism when you really stop and think about it. But even talking about plagiarism, let's talk about Egypt. Egypt. Okay, I mentioned before that Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Thales, Pythagoras, Archimedes, okay, and even Hippocrates had all spent time in Egypt. As George James in his Stolen Legacy book said, they were Egyptian mystery schools. Okay, but Egypt has really, when you're talking about present day scholars, as well as so-called 1800 scholars, not only plagiarized the works of the Egyptians, they also misrepresented the Egyptians. First of all, Egypt is in Africa. Egypt is in Africa. And instead, Western scholars invent a term called Middle East and put it there. But where is the Middle East? Okay. But what they're doing is conceptually separating Egypt from Africa. When Napoleon's men marched into Egypt and saw the Sphinx with his broad nose and African features, Napoleon's men took a cannon and shot the nose off of that Sphinx. And you notice that when you go into a lot of these British museums, you see a lot of the figures with their noses knocked off. Of course, Egyptologists will say, well, that was just a generation experiment, or the nose trying to fell off, any kind of excuse. But in reality, those British and French and various other Western European Egyptologists could not stand the idea of the ancient Egyptians being African. So the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about evidence, or provide evidence for you to support the idea that the ancient Egyptians were African people. Okay, evidence would be Herodotus, Aristotle in particular, and these are eyewitnesses. Eyewitnesses report of what the ancient Egyptians looked like. Herodotus and Aristotle, we're talking right around anywhere between 500, 400, 300 before Christ. And at that time period, we also have geography and also archaeology. Okay, let's talk about Herodotus. Herodotus, the father of history. Any Egyptologists or a lot of historians will always refer to Herodotus when they're talking about anything that happens during so-called ancient history. And Herodotus described the Egyptians as having black skin and woolly hair. Herodotus, an eyewitness, he'd seen them. He'd seen and lived with the Egyptians, ate with the Egyptians, studied with the Egyptians, spent time with the Egyptians. And he said the Egyptians had black skin and woolly hair. Then you have Aristotle. Aristotle mentioned that those who are too black are cowards, for instance, like the Egyptians and Ethiopians. Aristotle said those who are too black are cowards like the Egyptians and Ethiopians. In other words, Aristotle saw both the Egyptians and Ethiopians as the same people. Think about that. Here are pictures of Egyptians the way they saw themselves. These are among some of the artifacts that were dug up with the pyramids and during that time period. Okay, and some of these were even in the King Tut exhibit. But think about that. These are Egyptians the way they saw themselves. Look at these people. Do they look anything like the Egyptians you see in the movies? Here are more pictures. This one actually was in the King Tut exhibit when it came to Seattle. It was really interesting because I went to the King Tut exhibit back when it was in Philadelphia. And by the time I went through it, I was angry because they had the Egyptians, King Tut looking like a white person. Evidently, Molefi Asante and his students at Temple University went to the curators of that and had a talk with them. So by the time the exhibit came to Seattle, they had African-looking people in there. Okay, think about this. These are Egyptian musicians. Once again, this is the time in which the pyramids were built and during the ancient Egyptians. Look at the people. Do they look anything? Can you mistake them for anything but African? Remember, Aristotle saw the Egyptians and Ethiopians as the same people. These are more Egyptians, once again, coming on some of the walls and the tombs and the building structures in Egypt. Once again, look at the individuals. These aren't the ones that they show you in the textbooks. When you watch movies about Egypt, you see some weirdo Euro-Asian Freako type race there, where in reality, at the time the pyramids were built, there were Africans were in the pyramid. There were no Europeans in the Nile Valley at the time the pyramids were built. I remember one time going to Kenya, and I had some of the professors come up to me and say that Arabs built the pyramids. And I said, Arabs didn't exist when the pyramids were built. Arabs came around somewhere around 1300 BC. The pyramids were built before 2000 BC. Some even say it may be 2500 to 3000 BC. So Arabs didn't exist when the pyramids came. Arabs are descendants of Abraham. Abraham was right around 1300 BC. Okay, so once again, these are more Egyptians. This is how they saw themselves. This is Narmer. Basically, Narmer, in terms of, look at his features. Those are definitely West African features. Anybody see the Scorpion King? Okay, I take Rock. I say Rock was okay. I'll take Rock as far as being okay. That's close anyway. Okay, here are more Egyptian art. These pictures on the left are the so-called Nubian soldiers. Now, a lot of your Egyptologists will try to say that the Nubians and Ethiopians were a, quote, different race. No, according to Ivan Van Sertima, Chianta Diop, Molefi Asante, Martin Bernal, they were the same people. Once again, there's another picture of ancient Egyptians at the time where how they saw themselves. Okay. Count Volney, he was one of the individuals who actually saw the Sphinx before the nose was shot off. Okay, and he said undeniably that the builders of these pyramids were African, okay, and former slaves. But think about someone who's been raised and bred on the idea that Africans are savages, and raised and bred on the idea that Europeans contributed everything there was to be important to the world. And then you see a picture or an image of this African who you enslave as being a builder of something beyond their imagination. Okay, of course they got angry. Of course they wanted to shoot the nose off. But at the same time, they turned it around and took credit and tried to claim this culture as European. Once again, here's a picture. This is also in the King Tut exhibit. King Tut and his mother. Look at the pictures. Okay, you can't mistake that for anything except an African or a black person. You can't mistake that for Arab. You can't mistake that for any other institution. Once again, these pictures, when you look at Egypt or these magazines, National Geographic come out Egypt and those type of topics, you rarely see pictures like that. And when you do see black people, they haven't been slaves, but they use lighten the pictures up. It's really interesting. There's one of the recent National Geographics came out talking about ancient civilizations, the great ancient civilizations. And what amazed me was they left Egypt all the way out of it. They started with Mesopotamia between the Tigris and the Euphrates village. But if the pyramids predated a lot of those issues, a lot of those concepts. Here are more Egyptian soldiers. A lot of Egyptologists will try to say that those were helmets. That's their hair. Those are afros. Okay, or haircuts. It was like that. They try to say those were helmets. Those are their haircuts. Used to paint is kind of falling off of some of those. Here's Ramses. Ramses, if you know anything, if you read the Old Testament, Ramses was the Pharaoh that chased Moses out of Egypt. Moses is really an interesting individual in the sense that Moses spent most of his early life among the Egyptians. Okay, George James and Ivan Van Sertima and also Martin Bernal talk about the idea that Moses was an Egyptian priest. Okay, and actually, you talk about Van Sertima and Runoko Rashidi, they're saying that basically the Exodus was just two groups of black people leaving Egypt. And real Egyptians, there's some more real Egyptians, but also you think about Egyptians in terms of the Exodus. They've done research and they found that the Ethiopian Jews from Ethiopia, DNA-wise, are closer to Moses than any of the other Jews from any other place. Think about that. Okay, in terms of DNA-wise, they're close. People, the Ethiopian Jews, are closer to Moses than any other group from any other part of the world. Cheops, once again, the builder of the pyramid. Okay, so he was the one that had the African features looking down, and now they cut the nose off. And talking about, think about that in terms of the mentality of a person, a group of people who hated that image, and the image angered them so bad they had to shut the nose down to maintain a false image of what history is. Hannibal is another individual. We're moving now about 1,000 years forward, or maybe 400 years forward from Aristotle. Okay, Hannibal Barca. Hannibal was the one who had the I guess your ruler general who traveled across the Alps with elephants and almost marched on Rome. Okay, these are coins found with a picture of Hannibal on the back of the elephant. Of course, historians, whenever they talk about Hannibal, they always have some European individual playing Hannibal, and Eurocentric so-called pseudo scholars will try to say that that wasn't Hannibal on those coins. That was a elephant keeper. Okay, as Dr. Jones said, they don't put just regular elephant keepers on their coins. Okay, that was African on the coin. And now recently, Denzel Washington is playing Hannibal in the new movie about Hannibal, and the people of Tunisia are angry about that. Say we don't want Hannibal to be portrayed as a black man. Now stop and think about what's wrong with being black? What's that? How do we be black? Same thing with Kevin Hart. He was banned from Egypt. He was going to do a stand-up show in Egypt, and when he said the Egyptians were black, they canceled the show. And think about that. What the mentality of someone like that? Why? What's wrong with someone being black? If it was a white guy playing, they wouldn't have had a problem with it. But why are they angry about a black person playing someone who's great? And let's go further. Let's look at other issues. Namibian cavalry. Namibians, these were a group of black people who rode horses. And basically, they were also a part of Napoleon's army. One of the things about Napoleon's army, the Romans had a hard time fighting them because they had all kinds of people. They had elephants, they had horses, they had people with really good bows and arrows. Okay, they had all types of, they had all types of people fighting to support them. They were more of a, you're talking about Carthage in general. Most of their soldiers were mercenaries. They had people from all over, and because the Romans had a hard time fighting them, they didn't really understand how to fight them. West Africa, let's talk a little bit about West Africa, Mali. You talking about Mali? Okay, you talk about Africans were performing cataract surgeries in the 1400s, 12, 13, 1400s in Mali. You had Mansa Musa, at one time was one of the richest men in the world. Okay, once again, you never hear about this in terms of, you talking about Western civilization or world history. They don't talk about Mansa Musa. They don't talk about the Egyptians being African. Well, what is that? That's stealing ideas from other cultures and taking them as your own. That is also plagiarism. Let me talk Moors. The Moors ruled Spain somewhere between 700 and 1490. 1490. It was when Isabella and Ferdinand married, and they had enough political power to chase the Moors out of Spain, okay, and push them back into Africa. That's how, if you read Shakespeare or any other writers during that time period, whenever you hear that they're referring to Moors, whether it's Othello or those other folks, they're referring to Black people. See, Moors, we were called as Moors before slavery. After slavery, Africans become referred to as Negroes. Here's a picture that was probably drawn somewhere around maybe 1,000, or somewhere between 500 and 1,000 AD. And you notice, you see Black people playing chess. Africans, Black people playing chess. Okay, when Europeans were still pretty much living in caves. Okay, further, you think about this. There's another picture of Moors, Lane Pool, an author called Lane Pool, and also Ranoko Rashidi. The World of Moors have documentations of the Moors. A lot of your mathematics, okay, came from the Moors. How about the Renaissance? In theory, the Moorish occupation of Europe is one of the contributors to the so-called Renaissance. Okay, let's think about the Renaissance for a minute. These are also Egyptians today. But the Renaissance, what you had was a bunch of veterans returning from a series of wars called the Crusades, with new ideas, new clothes, the idea of telescope, magnifying glasses, cotton clothes, and even a number system, Cicero, okay, which stimulated the so-called Renaissance. Okay. These are also another aspect of plagiarism. Lewis Latimer. Everybody says when you talking about who invented the light bulb, who you say? Thomas Edison. Well, Lewis Latimer actually invented the light bulb because Black people weren't allowed to have patents back then. It was given to Thomas Edison. Okay. Also, Lewis Latimer has reportedly also helped Alexander Graham Bell on the telephone. But think about that. Imagine the whole idea of contributions of people being ignored. They wiped this out of history books and put other people's names on them. Then you have Garrett Morgan. Garrett Morgan, one of his inventions was a gas mask. Okay, and also the stoplight. Once again, you don't really hear much about Garrett Morgan. See, we're talking about Florida and Texas, and so these other red states are doing everything they can to erase us from history, Africans and from the history, erase Africans from society. And according to Clyde Anderson, trying to push African Americans into a permanent underclass. The problem is the information, lies, oftentimes eventually get uncovered, and the truth eventually comes out. And that's what we're seeing now in terms of age of information. Also, this is Henry Thomas Sampson. He's the one who made it possible for us to use cell phones, the cell phone technology. And then we have Gladys West. She's one of the people who helped invent or create the GPS system that we use on our cell phones and locators. None of these folks are mentioned in history. And they want to talk about Black history. This is American history. In reality, this information should not just be considered Black history as American history, but think about the impact that it has on developing children. Okay, these are also information that I want you to check out. In terms of plagiarism, though, people talking about how plagiarism, but then when is it bad and when is it good? Okay, in theory, no plagiarism is good. But if you look throughout Western European history, Western Europeans did a lot of plagiarism. And then you have plagiaristic hypocrite Bill Akerman, who forced the president of Harvard University to resign because he was angry because the students on the campus were protesting Palestine, the situation in Palestine. Okay, she stepped down, but the protesting not only continued, it's gotten bigger. Okay, but the irony is I call him plagiaristic hypocrite because his wife also plagiarized. But what people don't realize is that technology or that program they use to detect plagiarism, if you put it in any book, it's going to show up a plagiarism. I mean, that's how defined that is. And also the plagiarism that the Harvard president had was not to not give people credit. And the people who she plagiarized, allegedly plagiarized, said it's okay because she mentioned their name somewhere during her essay. And so when you talk about plagiarism and who gets charged for plagiarism and who doesn't, that's what the real issue is. Now, let's change gears and talk about the significance of this. Okay, why do we need, if we're going to talk about plagiarism, let's talk about passing across the board. Why is this information erased? Why do they not want people to know the Egyptians were African? Why do you not want to know about all these inventors and people? Because they want to suppress the information. And really, the Times is really interesting because they're trying to erase the truth. Well, the election was bogus, or that's what they're trying to. People are trying to say the election was bogus, it was false. Okay, and you have all these false ideas and false theories coming out. And the irony is, we're living in an age of information. Thanks to Google and some of these other search engines, you can find anything about anything. The problem is the information is questioned. You have to cipher through what is true and what is not true, because you have certain sites and certain groups of people who are constantly promoting information that is not true. So you think about plagiarism, but also think about truth. Plagiarism has been used by Western scholars to erase the truth. Okay, we're not going to teach about any contributions or anything for this particular group of people. We don't want anybody to know that these particular people did anything contributing. We want to buy into the idea that Western Europeans are superior, made only contributions to society. So what we'll do, instead of write a true history, we'll create some myths and put them up in the textbooks as history. I'll repeat that. We'll make some myths and put them in the textbook and call it history. So now the question is, what's the difference between history and mythology? History versus mythology. In theory, history is supposed to be a series of documented events that occurred in different parts or different times. Okay. Now the question is, how accurate is this information? Well, it's used done through narratives, writings, historical events, disasters. But when you come to a group of people that are in Florida and Texas, and they're making up stuff and putting it in the history books as promoting his history. And I always hear several historians talk about history repeats itself. And as one historian once said, Dan Peterson, and also one of my former students, Julian Hayden, once said, history repeats itself because people don't learn from it. History repeats itself because people don't learn from it. So we're talking about the seriousness and the importance of, if you're going to teach history, it's important to teach it as accurately as possible. Okay? And teach it as accurate history versus mythology. Is that okay? In conclusion, I want to thank you for allowing me to present this information and promote Rainier Radio. And you'll probably put some more podcasts up in the future. If you like it, give me a thumbs up. If you have some comments, feel free to comment. And probably in the next few weeks, you'll be hearing from me again. Thank you very much, Charles Jeffries, Rainier Avenue Radio. I teach at Seattle Central College.